wars and internal divisions challenge Africa's integration efforts. What specific steps will you take to rekindle the spirit of Pan-Africanism, counter big power politics on the continent, mobilize African countries behind a common integration agenda, ensure resource self-reliance and position regional economic communities at the center of this process?
Cher candidat,
Distinguished candidates, your question is as follows in French.
l'africanisme est en déclin.
That we face today. We all know the problems of our African Union today. There are certain aspects that do not meet the expectations of the people. For example, the SACA audit that was prepared by experts proposing reforms that have to be undertaken. We also have reforms that were undertaken in 2016. So we need to undertake those reforms to ensure that the African Union can actually rise to the challenges. The regional economic communities also have a role to play. I went to COMESA for several years and actually saw the efforts undertaken by countries of COMESA and East Africa. And we see Tunisia, Egypt, in COMESA as well. And this will continue. We have the Abuja Treaty actually defined gradual integration at the regional level and then continental level. And I know we will get there. And I am going to work with the members of the next commission so that together we can actually make all of this easy. And lastly, I think we should also bear in mind, we should also think about the military bases, the foreign military bases in Africa, in African countries. Some countries have already started to take their own destiny in their hands in terms of their security. We should be brave enough, we should actually have that courage to make sure that we can actually stand out there as adults that can actually take their destiny in their own hands. Foreign military bases in Africa, we do hope that in a few years' time, those military bases will be a thing of the past because these military bases are actually a source of conflict. Thank you. Thank you very much, Excellency Randram Mandriato, candidate of Madagascar. Now we listen to Raila Amolo Odinga, candidate of Kenya.
Thank you. Well, I mentioned earlier on about the inter-African trade, which today stands just at 15%. Inter-European trade, on the other hand, stands at 70%. Inter-Asian trade stands at 60%. Africa trades more with the external world than with itself, wasting a lot of resources. Now, how did Europeans come from behind and leapfrog and overtake Africa? The jeep, the BMW, the Mercedes, the Toyota, the Nissan, they're all there in China. And because there's cheap, highly skilled, cheap labor. Secondly, cheap raw material. The raw materials which they were actually getting originally from Africa. And that is how China has managed to develop a 600 million people middle class. Africa can be able to fill the gap which is being left down there by China by actually coming together and opening up. So we need to come together as Africa and create an African market which will be able to attract investors to come to our continent. Africa is the youngest continent in terms of population. 70% of our population is below the age of 35. That is a big bonus. It can be a bonus or it can be a curse. If the youth are not empowered, given requisite knowledge and skills, they become a drug to society, drunkards, drug addicts, and criminals. But empowered, they become a real source for wealth creation. It is a pity today that many African youths drown in the Mediterranean trying to create conditions that can retain them here. Now we are saying that we want to create a situation where every African youth must be connected to the internet and using the artificial intelligence and information technology, we can be able to give this youth opportunity to work anywhere in the world when they're staying here on the continent. This is something that we are going to address, empowerment of the African youth, and together with the African woman, so that we create a workforce that will be helped in terms of wealth creation on the continent. This will enable Africa to leapfrog and to catch up with the rest of the world. I'm saying that I want to be a vehicle to be used to help Africa to get there. We will work together with all the leadership in the continent so that Africa moves.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Thank you very much, Your Excellency Raila Odinga, finishing us on the third round. And now we move into the fourth and final round, and I give my sister the opportunity to open the envelope and tell us what the first or the last question rather is. And ladies and gentlemen, as a form of a reminder, after this we have a quick break, and after the break each of our esteemed candidates will have 2 minutes to share their closing remarks. Fatima?
Cher
Dear candidates, your question is this one. The implementation of the key reforms at the African Union that were decided by the Assembly of Heads of State and Government has come to a standstill, and which has a negative impact on the structural stability and the financial viability of the Union, and also on the lack of the African Union to have an impact. Were you to become the chairperson, what new approaches would you adopt to reinvigorate the implementation of these reforms, rationalize the programs of the African Union, and strengthen its effectiveness in the long term?
Under the topic of implementing of reforms agreed under the Assembly Decision 635, the implementation of key African Union reforms decided by the Assembly of Heads of States and Governments has stalled, with an adverse impact on its structural viability and financial sustainability, and the AU's focus on a few high-impact public goods. If you become chairperson, what new approaches will you introduce to reinvigorate the implementation of these reforms, streamline the AU's agenda, and strengthen its long-term effectiveness?
Et j'invite à présent le candidat.
I'd like to invite the candidate from Madagascar to respond first. First of all, we have to begin by by bringing back order to our shared home, the African Union. I think this is the highest priority. The mandate of the chairperson of the commission as a whole is last 4 years. So that is a very short period of time to be able to change it from top to bottom. What needs to be changed in terms of institutional reforms of the African Union. So one must begin by bringing back order. I did mention a short while ago the recommendations of the SACA audit. I also mentioned the reforms that have already been proposed in 2016. There would be other reforms. What needs to be done were I to become the chairperson of the union would be to review the documents. And one cannot forget history. One cannot ignore history. I don't think we could. We are at the end of a process. We are at the beginning of a new process. And the outgoing team did what they were able to do with the resources that they had at their disposal. And I would like to thank the outgoing chairperson of the commission, Mr. Faki, and his entire team. And were I to be elected chairperson of the commission, I would work, of course, with the chairperson because it will be a lady chairperson. Now, these reforms have to be prioritized. There are reforms at the level of the financing of the African Union. There are reforms in terms of mobilization of strategic partnerships. There are, of course, issues that have to do with the effectiveness in the area of peace and security. So we have to prioritize the reforms. Yet, once again, 4 years is too short a period of time. It is therefore important to review objective by objective. Strategic objective is what I mean of the 10-year plan 2024-2032. And since it was my responsibility in COMESA, one can perhaps plan for strategic planning over perhaps 2-3 years, which strategic planning would make it possible for us to identify the urgent issues and to align the financing of these issues. The 10-year plan does not allow one to do this. And maybe were we to have a strategic plan, we could perhaps be more specific and address the matters that need to be addressed urgently in the way of reforms. And I also think, as I said a short while ago, that the organs of the African Union, beginning with the Conference of Heads of State and Government, but also the committee of the PRC, the Permanent Representatives Committee with the Pan-African Parliament and the other organs, all the organs of the African Union should agree on the speed they should work at, so that at the end of the day, the reforms become visible, become tangible, and that the citizens of the continent can appreciate the effectiveness of a new the effectiveness of the new African Union led by a new team. Thank you.
And now I yield the microphone to you, Excellency Raila Odinga. 4 minutes, sir.
Well, we know where we are as African Union, and that's why the heads of state came up with that committee on reforms, which was headed by former president, current Rwanda President Kagame. The chairmanship has now been passed over to Honorable William Ruto, President of Kenya. I have had long discussions with President Kagame when he was chairing that committee, because I was working as a high representative of the AU on issues of infrastructure. And I know the kind of frustrations that you feel working that way. I know that 93% of the resolutions that are passed by the heads of state at the assembly are never implemented. Now, there's some of them are resolutions which were probably not necessary. Some of them are not implementable, but majority of them are just not implemented. Some have to do with the structure and management of the AU at the headquarters. I'm not trying to pass any judgment here because I know that Mr. Faki has worked very hard to try to make the organization move forward. The other one has been the issue of funding, which has been a major challenge, and look at other alternative sources of funding. When I was there as High Rep on infrastructure development, we came up with a proposal to set up an infrastructure fund for Africa, and using the African resources, because many of African countries have got a lot of money in sovereign funds, from which the AU can actually borrow without having to pay so much high interest. And this will help AU actually to spearhead the process of constructing some of these infrastructures. I mentioned the Trans-African Railway Network, Lagos to Cairo, the high speed. Then you have got Beira in Mozambique to Lobito in Angola and Walvis Bay in Namibia. Then you have got the LAPSET, which will come from Lamu in Kenya, running through South Sudan, Central Africa to Kribi in Cameroon, to create a land bridge that opens the interior of Africa and gives these landlocked countries in the continent access to the sea. So some of these are possible, but we need to think out of the box and ensure that most of these reforms which are being proposed are implemented. We were talking about energy, which is a very major issue. And we've got the Grand Inga in the Congo, which can actually power the entire continent with power pools, southern power pool, eastern power pool, central, western, and northern power pool. That will help us to lower the cost of energy in the continent. That would be a revolutionary change on the continent. Then you've got the connectivity, fiber optic connectivity, open skies, opening up the skies for movement of people. And then visas, to do visas are a big issue. Many African businessmen cannot travel across the continent because they don't have visas.
Excellency, I'm really sorry to interrupt you. Les 4 minutes se sont écoulées. Nous allons maintenant suivre.
We are going now to listen to the response from the last candidate for this round, the candidate from Djibouti.
Let me start by paying tribute to our heads of states who have endorsed those reforms in 2017. And then the champion for those reforms was His Excellency President Kagame, and he passed the responsibility to President Ruto. Now, there are a number of reforms that have already been implemented. We have to recognize that. The size of the commission, we had 10 commissioners, chairperson, deputy chairperson, and 8 commissioners, and it has been reduced. We have what we call a golden rule in terms of managing the staff and the personnel. I'm still waiting for the SACA program to be implemented. I hope that this hot potato will not wait for us, one of us, when we'll be elected. But I hope that the SACA process will be implemented. It is about the personnel, the staff. We have moved from a lot of short contract employees to a permanent contract. That's very important. If you want to create loyalty, you want to create the ownership within your staff and personnel, you have to make them happy. They need to have a permanent contract, and it is in the SACA program. Now, the biggest bottleneck of the reforms is the financing. Our heads of state said we will pay 0.2% of eligible import to the Commission. Only 17 countries, 17, are applying and abiding by that rule. It has to change. I'm not going to impose that on our leaders. It's not my intention, but I will advocate for it. It's very important to have, that particular issue of mobilizing and fostering financing be resolved immediately. Then, our experts, there is a unit in the African Union Commission called the Reform Unit, led by Mr. Makoko, a very able African expert. But there are so many reforms that have not been implemented. One of them is PAP, the Pan-African Parliament. It's still a consultative organ. When is the Pan-African Parliament will become a legislative organ? We have passed in 2014 a protocol. Only 15 countries ratified that protocol. And this is one of the major reforms that we have to implement. Then we have on the judicial sector, the Court of Justice, the Commission of Human Rights. Sometimes they are fighting on issues. The Court of Justice do not open its doors to nationals, to African citizens, to NGOs. They are complaining. I am hearing complaints about the African citizens with regard to the Court of Justice. And then they are fighting who is doing what, the Commission of Human Rights. These reforms have to be implemented. And the Bureau of Liaison, a liaison bureau, we have so many on the continent. That's double use of those bureaus. Time is running, time is flying. So we have to rationalize. How can you imagine that you have 3 bureaus in the same region? And we're saying we should have the golden rules for management. And whenever we want to touch one of the bureaus, it's a political matter. It's useless, but it is a political matter. The country that is hosting the bureau is saying, you won't touch it. It has to change. It needs leadership. It needs understanding, negotiation, but it has to change. If you want to change things, we have to be frank and outspoken. We have to be, really tough when it comes to be tough, and lean when it comes to we have to do it. We have to do it.
Yes, sir, your time is up. And now, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of round 4. If you are just joining us, we've had 4 rounds, and each of them has touched on a thematic area. And now we will go for a quick break. When we come back, the candidates each have 2 minutes to share their closing remarks.
Mesdames et messieurs, nous remercions bien.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to thank our dear candidates for having responded to the last question of the 4th round of this Mjadala Africa Leadership Debate of the African Union. Thank you very much for staying with us. We'll come back in a few minutes. We're going to take another short break. And after the break, each candidate will have 2 minutes to make their closing remarks. See you in a short while.
Ladies and 3, 4, 5. Ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and 3, 2. Hello. 1, 2.
Mesdames et messieurs, merci beaucoup.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming back with us. So we're going to reconvene in a few minutes for the closure of the Mjadala Africa Leadership Debate of the African Union. Thank you very much for having joined us this evening.
Last part of our programming this evening. Please take your seats. Thank you. May we assemble all our candidates, please. As we proceed into the last part of our debate today, Mjadala Africa Leadership Debate 2024. And we want to say a special thank you to our audience around the world. The questions you sent truly informed the kinds of questions that we then asked our panel here. And we are very happy that you were very involved. It goes to show that indeed the Africa we want is in your hands and that you are actively involved in doing this together. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we are back to our last session. My name is Anita Erskine, and I'm joined here by my colleague Fatima Sharif, who is our French speaker.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Anita. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us for this final lap of the Mjadala Africa Leadership Debate of the African Union. You have listened during the debate, the questions that were raised, the answers that were given by the different candidates, and we're coming to the end of the debate. And so, Anita, we're going to listen to the closing remarks to the candidates. So thank you very much, Fatima.
Candidates, you each have 2 minutes to share your closing remarks, or better still, your last words. We will start this round with His Excellency Raila Odinga.
Thank you. I am delighted to have had the opportunity to address our people of Africa. And as I've said, I am ready to work for Africa. There are reforms that will be necessary so that the AU can work more effectively. One of these reforms will be financial reforms, so that we are able to bring in the African private sector into the funding. I mentioned also the issue of sovereign funds that we can use. We can create a fund that will enable AU to do all its